Claire Dawson, once a gifted legal translator, now spends her days scrubbing floors at Sunrise Electronics, a struggling factory. But when her boss, the arrogant director, mocks her for being just a cleaner, challenging her to translate a stack of foreign documents, Claire's hidden skills spark to life. What begins as a simple task becomes a dangerous game of power and deception, with Claire holding the key to exposing a corporate scandal. Little does he know, Claire is about to turn the tables, and his mockery will cost him more than he ever imagined. Claire Dawson, a middle-aged cleaning lady at Sunrise Electronics, drags her feet through the factory's dim industrial hallways. The air is thick with the smell of rust and oil, and the hum of aging machinery fills the background. OT, sound of life, but one that is barely holding on. It's a cold, grey morning in Cleveland, Ohio. Snow falls relentlessly outside, but inside the factory, the chill is just as biting, sinking into Claire's bones as she moves through the factory's forgotten corners. This factory, this life, it wasn't supposed to be this way, Claire reflects. 10 years ago, I had a future ahead of me, one filled with legal documents and courtroom debates. But now I scrub floors, hoping to avoid being late again. The weight of those words is heavy, echoing her quiet resignation. She's not just cleaning, she's cleaning up the messes life has left behind. Claire's past feels like another lifetime. Once she was at the top of her game, an accomplished legal translator, sharp-minded and ambitious. She had dreams, and the world seemed to stretch before her, full of promise. But everything changed when her mother fell ill, her health declining, rapidly and draining Claire's savings. The responsibility of caring for her mother shifted her path, and just like that, Claire's promising career vanished. Her textbooks and legal jargon were replaced with mop buckets and industrial floors. In this place, there's no room for the past. Claire's old skills, once admired by professors, now gather dust, forgotten, but there's still a flicker of that intellect within her. Beneath the rags of the cleaning uniform, her sharp mind has not disappeared. The factory, a relic of a better time, is teetering on the brink of collapse, much like Claire's spirit. Yet in the silence of the factory halls, there is something more, a potential just waiting to be awakened. She might scrub floors, but her mind still holds the answers to things far beyond this factory's dusty corners. Richard Kane, the factory's director, was a man who knew how to command a room, not with wisdom or competence, but with sheer manipulation and an air of ruthless authority. A towering figure in both stature and ego, he stood in sharp contrast to Claire, cocky, self-assured, and constantly aware of the factory's crumbling state. Yet his only focus wasn't on saving the place he ran, but rather on maintaining his grip on power, no matter the cost. Claire moved quietly through the factory, her cleaning cart rolling softly across the faded floors, her mind occupied with more than just the grime she wiped away. It was in this quiet routine that her sharp eye caught something, a stack of documents, foreign and out of place on Richard Kane's desk. The text on the pages was German, a language Claire once excelled in during her legal studies. A flicker of recognition stirred within her, a reminder of a life where she had control, intellect, and respect. As she leaned closer, drawn by the familiarity of the language, the sharp sound of footsteps broke the silence. Richard Kane appeared in the doorway, his gaze immediately locking onto Claire. His lips curled into a sly, mocking smile. "So, you think you're smart, huh?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Go ahead, translate it for us. Let's see if you're still as clever as you used to be." His tone was deliberately dismissive, the challenge in his eyes clear. He thought this would be a joke, a way to remind her of her place. But for Claire, this wasn't just about translating foreign words. It was about something much deeper. It was about reclaiming a piece of the woman she once was, a woman who could command respect in any room, a woman who knew how to use her mind as her strongest weapon. She could walk away, ignore the insult, and continue with the job that life had given her. But she didn't. The mockery wasn't something she could simply brush off. With a steady breath, Claire took a step closer to the desk, her hands trembling only slightly. She unfolded the top document, and as the words began to fall from her lips, a rush of memories surged within her. The legal jargon she once mastered was now a bridge between her past and the present, simple yet dangerous in its implications. The letters felt familiar, but as she read on, the unease in her gut grew. What she was translating was more than just text. It was the beginning of something that could unravel everything Richard Kane had worked so hard to hide. Her mind began to race as the implications of the contract became clear. She wasn't just reading German anymore. She was uncovering a secret that could bring down the very empire Kane had built on lies. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her, and in that moment, Claire realized that the mockery wasn't just a challenge. It was a turning point. What started as a simple translation had now turned into the key to exposing a corruption that could destroy everything Kane had worked to protect. As Claire continued to translate, the words on the pages began to blur together, each line feeling heavier than the last. The document appeared innocuous at first, a standard sale agreement for the factory, a transaction between Sunrise Electronics and a powerful German electronics firm. But as her eyes scanned the text, something caught her attention, a clause. Buried deep within the contract was anything but standard. It was a provision that made Claire's blood run cold. Hidden behind legal jargon was a stipulation that, if financial misconduct was uncovered within the factory's operations, the new owners had the right to oust the current management, including Richard Kane. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. Claire's fingers trembled, the weight of the discovery crashing down on her. If the investors found out about Kane's questionable financial practices, it wouldn't just be his position at risk. It would be the entire factory, the factory that had been on the verge of collapse for years, its machines aging and its workers, struggling to make ends meet, could be completely dismantled. The news could lead to mass layoffs, the loss of hundreds of jobs, and the destruction of everything the workers had worked for. The factory wasn't just a building, it was their livelihood, their future, and Claire was now the sole keeper of its fate. Her heart raced as she sat there, the weight of the secret pressing down on her. If she exposed the clause, it could bring down Kane, and with him, the entire structure of the factory. But at what cost? The workers, the people she had silently fought alongside for years, could lose everything. And what about herself? Would she become a target for Kane's wrath? Would her own survival be at risk if she exposed the truth? Claire's internal conflict was sharp and immediate. She had a choice to make: expose the truth and risk the factory's collapse, the lives of the workers, and her own safety, or remain silent and protect herself from Kane's likely retribution. The decision was agonizing. She felt trapped between the survival of the workers and the moral responsibility to expose the truth. But one thing was clear: Claire had unknowingly stepped into a far more dangerous situation than she had ever imagined. What she had uncovered was no longer just about legal jargon. It was about power, survival, and the integrity of a system that was built on lies. At lunch, Claire sat alone in the break room, staring down at the stack of translated papers. The weight of the discovery was suffocating, and her thoughts raced. She needed to talk to someone who could help her make sense of what she had found and understand the magnitude of the danger. But who could she trust? Most of the factory staff barely knew her. She was the invisible cleaner, a fixture, but not a person. But there was one person who saw her differently: Susan Harper, the factory's chief accountant. Susan was tough, pragmatic, and not easily swayed. A woman with a keen eye for numbers, she had been at the factory for years and had built a reputation for her meticulous work. Unlike most of the others, Susan had always treated Claire with a quiet respect. She never judged her for her position, never saw her as just another cog in the machine. Claire knew that Susan would understand, maybe not completely, but enough to help her make the right choice. When Susan walked into the break room, Claire wasted no time. She leaned forward, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening, then whispered, "I need to show you something." She handed Susan the translated pages, her hands shaking slightly as she did. As Susan's eyes scanned the text, Claire explained the clause she had uncovered, the one that could unravel everything. The German firm's potential to remove Richard Kane and take control if the financial misconduct was discovered. Susan's face shifted, the lines of concern deepening as she processed the information. The gravity of what Claire had found was apparent in her silence. After a long pause, Susan looked up, her gaze steady but full of caution. "You're brave, or foolish," she said quietly. "Kane's been running this place for 15 years. Nobody crosses him, and nobody survives doing so." The words were heavy, each one laced with the unspoken knowledge that the risks were not just personal, but could have far-reaching consequences. Claire could see the conflict in Susan's eyes, the same fear that gnawed at her own. They both knew what was at stake. The factory had become a place of shadows, ruled by Kane's iron grip, and any attempt to expose his wrongdoings could bring down more than just his reputation. Claire's heart pounded, her mind flashing with the potential fallout, the workers who would lose their jobs, the factory that might be torn apart. Yet she could not ignore the truth. She had already crossed a line. Her conscience could not turn back. "I can't stay silent," Claire finally said, her voice firm, despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. "I've come this far, Susan. I can't pretend I didn't see this. We have to do something." Susan's eyes softened with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "I get it," she said quietly. "But be careful. Kane's a dangerous man. This won't be easy." The decision had been made. Despite the fear, despite the risks, Claire knew there was no going back now. She had uncovered the truth, and now she had to face the consequences. She wasn't just a cleaner anymore. She had become a reluctant whistleblower, a guardian of something much bigger than herself. And she couldn't walk away from it. As Claire continued to translate the contract, the weight of her discovery seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The words on the pages were no longer just legal jargon. They were a ticking time bomb. Every paragraph she uncovered felt like another step toward exposing the truth. And the closer she came to the end of the document, the more her anxiety intensified. The German investors were expected soon, and everyone at Sunrise Electronics knew that something significant was about to unfold. Whispers had already begun to circulate among the factory workers, the air thick with tension and uncertainty. The factory, once a place of routine and monotony, now felt charged with a quiet but palpable sense of dread. Kane's presence loomed over everything, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. She'd always kept a low profile, blending into the background, but now every step she took seemed to be under scrutiny. The factory's loyalists, the ones who had been with Kane for years, began eyeing her with suspicion. They weren't used to her being anywhere other than the cleaning aisles, and her recent shift in behavior didn't go unnoticed. Her once inaudible presence was now a matter of curiosity. Claire's interactions with her co-workers, once brief and minimal, had started to change. She no longer kept to herself, her quiet demeanor replaced by a sense of urgency that was hard to ignore. The workers began to ask questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Claire found herself avoiding eye contact, slipping into corners to work on the contract and hurrying through her cleaning duties. The workers, though kind in their own way, were beginning to notice the unease in her, the way she was no longer just a cleaner. She had become something more, something dangerous, even if she hadn't intended it. The factory was already on the brink of collapse. Workers were already on edge, their jobs uncertain, their futures hanging by a thread. Now Claire was caught between the mounting risk of exposure and the truth she knew could change everything. If she continued down this path, the exposure of the clause could ignite a storm, one that could tear the factory apart and change her life forever. But the longer she stayed silent, the more she would lose of herself. The choice before her was simple yet devastating. Remain quiet, protect her place in the factory, and stay hidden in the shadows, or risk it all, her safety, her job, and the fragile stability of the factory, to expose the truth. But Claire knew one thing: the longer she hesitated, the harder it would be to step forward. The truth was now embedded in her, and no matter how much fear gnawed at her, she could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about doing what was right, even if it meant risking everything. The tension between Claire and Richard Kane had been building for days. Claire could feel it in the air. Kane knew something was wrong. He could sense that she was no longer the quiet, invisible cleaner she had been for years. She had become a threat, and he was determined to find out why. It wasn't long before Claire received the summons. Kane's voice crackled through the intercom, his tone sharp and commanding. "Claire, get to my office now." Claire's stomach tightened. She had been waiting for this moment, but she wasn't sure what to expect. As she entered Kane's office, the heavy door closed behind her with a thud, and the tension in the room was suffocating. Richard Kane sat behind his desk, his steely eyes fixed on her, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "You've been acting strange lately. What's going on?" Claire stood tall, her back straight and her eyes unwavering. She wasn't the frightened cleaning lady anymore. She was someone who knew the truth, something Kane could never control. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice steady, though the adrenaline was coursing through her veins. Kane leaned forward, his hands clenched on the desk. "Listen carefully, Claire. You're nothing but a cleaner here. You think you're some kind of legal expert? Stay in your lane, or you'll regret it." The threat was clear, but for the first time in a long while, Claire didn't flinch. Her heart pounded, but she didn't back down. The words he spoke, full of disdain and arrogance, only strengthened her resolve. She had come too far. "I'm not afraid of you, Richard," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had uncovered. "I know what you've been hiding." Kane's expression shifted, just slightly, but it was enough. His facade of control began to crack, and for a brief moment Claire could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't as untouchable as he liked to believe. Before he could respond, the sound of the factory's front door opening interrupted them. Claire didn't flinch. She knew who it was. The German investors had arrived. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment that would determine the factory's future. The meeting that followed was tense. The room was filled with executives, factory staff, and the investors who had come to scrutinize Sunrise Electronics. As the meeting unfolded, the German investors began asking pointed questions about the factory's financials, questions that Claire knew would lead to the truth. Kane, as poised as ever, stood at the head of the room, attempting to maintain control. But when the investors began questioning the discrepancies in the third quarter report, Claire saw it. The moment Kane faltered, his composure slipped, just enough to reveal the cracks in his armor. He stammered for a moment, then quickly recovered. But Claire could see the sweat gathering at his brow. For the first time, Richard Kane was on the defensive. The calm, controlled exterior he had so carefully crafted was beginning to unravel. The German investors were sharp, their questions piercing through the veil of Kane's lies. Claire's heart raced as she realized this was it, the turning point. The truth was coming to light, and there was no turning back now. The empire Kane had built was finally beginning to crumble, and Claire held the key to exposing it all. The room fell into a heavy silence as Claire stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The air felt thick with anticipation, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. All the work she had put into translating the contract, the long hours of studying, the danger she had placed herself in, all of it had led to this single point in time. With a steady breath, Claire looked directly at Richard Kane, who had been standing at the front, his confident posture now faltering as the tension in the room mounted. The German investors were seated around the table, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Claire knew that this was her moment to act. She cleared her throat, gathering every ounce of courage she had left. "I have something to add," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. As she spoke, She pulled the translated pages from her folder, placing them on the table in front of the investors. Their gaze flicked from her to the documents, confused at first, then sharpening with suspicion. "There's a clause in this contract that changes everything," Claire continued, her voice unwavering. "It's a provision that, if financial misconduct is found, the new owners have the right to remove the current management, including Richard Kane." The room went silent, the realization of what Claire had just revealed sinking in. Kane's face turned pale, his usual arrogance quickly replaced by a flicker of fear. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, exposed. The very empire he had built was now at risk, all because of the fraudulent activities he had carefully concealed for years. The investors exchanged looks, their faces registering disbelief. Kane, who had controlled every aspect of the factory, who had silenced anyone who dared to question him, was now on the brink of losing everything. Without warning, one of the investors raised his hand. "A full audit," he said, his voice cold and firm. "We need a full audit immediately." Kane's face reddened with anger and panic. He sputtered, but the room was no longer listening to him. The investors, having heard enough, signaled for the meeting to be adjourned. For the first time, Claire felt a surge of power as the once dominant man she had feared for so long stood on the precipice of his downfall. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. Over the next few days, Claire, Susan, and Mark Sullivan, who had quietly supported Claire from the start, worked tirelessly to gather evidence of Kane's manipulations. They sifted through financial reports, conducted interviews with the staff, and uncovered more of the dirty secrets Kane had tried to bury. Each new discovery confirmed what Claire had already known. The factory's future had been jeopardized by Kane's greed, and now it was all coming to light. The factory, once a place of drudgery and despair, had become a battleground. The workers were watching closely, the tension in the air palpable. But amidst the chaos, Claire found herself more determined than ever. The truth was no longer something she could hide from. It had become the weapon she wielded to fight for the factory's survival. Kane's empire was crumbling, and Claire knew that the battle was far from over. But for the first time, she was no longer just a bystander. She had become the catalyst for change, the voice that exposed the truth and set the factory on a path toward redemption. The days following the full audit were a whirlwind of activity. The factory that had once felt like a cold, lifeless machine was now at the center of a storm of change. The investors, having seen the full extent of Richard Kane's corruption, moved quickly. It wasn't long before they called an emergency meeting with the factory's senior staff, including Claire, Susan, and Mark. As the meeting began, the tension in the room was palpable. The investors, with their sharp eyes and cold demeanor, wasted no time. The verdict was clear. Kane was fired. The board had made their decision. The man who had controlled the factory with an iron fist for years was gone, his empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own deceit. But what came next caught Claire by surprise. One of the investors turned to her, their expression unreadable. "Claire Dawson," he began, his voice steady but firm, "we've seen what you've done for this factory. You've uncovered the truth, and we believe you're the one who can lead it into the future. Effective immediately, you will be appointed as the interim executive director." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Claire's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she couldn't speak. From cleaning lady to interim executive director, she had never imagined anything like this. But the weight of the decision was not lost on her. This wasn't just a promotion. This was a transformation. Claire was now responsible for the future of the factory, the livelihoods of the workers, and the delicate process of rebuilding everything Kane had torn down. It was a bitter irony. The very role she had once dreamed of, the one she had worked so hard to attain, had been handed to her at a time when the factory was on the brink of collapse. She had been thrust into leadership not by choice, but by necessity. As Claire walked Out of the meeting, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. She was now the leader of Sunrise Electronics, but the road ahead would be anything but easy. The workers, many of whom had been loyal to Kane, were skeptical of her sudden rise to power. To them, she was still the woman who had spent years cleaning their floors, not someone who belonged at the head of the factory. The hostility was palpable, and Claire could feel the cold stares of the workers as she walked through the factory floor. She knew that trust would not be given easily. Kane had ruled with fear, and his former allies still clung to the power he had granted them. Claire would have to navigate a delicate balance, earning the respect of those who had once seen her as invisible, while dismantling the power structure that had kept the factory in a stranglehold for so long. Her first few days as interim executive director were a test of her resolve. Claire spent long hours meeting with the workers, listening to their concerns, and beginning the difficult process of rebuilding trust. She knew the workers had been through enough. They needed reassurance that the factory had a future, and that future didn't involve the corruption and mismanagement of Kane's regime. As she moved through the factory, meeting with different departments and addressing the concerns of the workers, Claire found herself feeling the weight of leadership more than ever. The decisions she made now carried consequences that could either save or destroy the factory. Every word she spoke, every action she took was scrutinized by those who had been loyal to Kane and by those who had suffered under his reign. But Claire was no longer the quiet woman who hid in the shadows. She had learned that leadership wasn't about titles or authority. It was about responsibility, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what was right. Slowly, Claire began to earn the respect of the workers, showing them that she was there not just to lead, but to help them rebuild something they could all be proud of. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Claire doubted herself. But with the support of Susan, Mark, and the few loyal employees who had stayed true to her, Claire began to see a glimmer of hope. The factory was not beyond saving. It was just in need of a new kind of leadership, a leadership built on transparency, honesty, and a commitment to the people who had been forgotten for so long. In the end, Claire's transformation from cleaning lady to interim executive director wasn't just about power. It was about redemption, not just for the factory, but for herself. She had fought for the truth, exposed the lies, and now she was fighting to restore the factory to its rightful place. The journey ahead was long, but for the first time, Claire felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Despite Richard Kane's removal, his presence still loomed over the factory like a shadow. Though ousted from his position, he was not ready to relinquish control so easily. He had built a network of loyalists within the factory, people who still followed his commands, and they were now undermining Claire's efforts at every turn. Equipment failures, missing supplies, and mysterious delays. Every obstacle seemed to be orchestrated, each move more calculated than the last. Kane's retaliation was quiet but vicious, a war fought in the shadows. The workers, already uneasy after the abrupt leadership shift, began to feel the strain. Rumors circulated about Kane's involvement in the sabotage, and production came to a near halt. The once bustling factory floor now felt like a tense battleground, with every worker eyeing their colleagues warily. Claire knew the factory's reputation was hanging by a thread. If she couldn't regain control, not only would the factory, Involta, but the workers, her workers, would lose everything. Desperation set in as the delays mounted. Claire knew the German investors were keeping a close eye on the factory's progress. They had placed their trust in her, and if she couldn't get production back on track, they might pull out entirely. One particularly critical shipment of parts was delayed due to missing inventory, parts that were necessary to fulfill a large contract that could save the factory from financial ruin. Without that shipment, Sunrise Electronics would face disaster. Claire, Susan, and Mark had no choice but to work in overdrive to track down the cause of the sabotage. As they dug deeper, they discovered the extent of Kane's covert operation. Parts were being deliberately withheld, machinery was being tampered with, and vital documents were going missing. Kane's loyalists were using every tool at their disposal to ensure the factory's failure. It was clear now that this wasn't just about revenge. It was a calculated effort to destroy everything Claire was working to rebuild. Time was running out. The clock was ticking, and Claire had to make a decision. Fight back with everything she had, or let Kane's forces win. She couldn't let that happen, not after everything she had worked for. With Mark's technical expertise and Susan's knowledge of the factory's finances, they began to isolate the culprits, one by one. Working with the German investors, Claire used their influence to crack down on the internal sabotage. In a tense showdown, Claire and her team managed to track down the missing parts just in time. They intercepted a shipment that had been diverted by Kane's loyalists, ensuring that it reached its destination without further delay. The factory's operations resumed, and production lines began to move again. The victory was hard-earned, but it was a crucial one. Kane's sabotage was thwarted, and with the factory back on track, Claire's leadership was solidified. The workers, who had watched her struggle against the sabotage, began to see her in a new light. The factory's rhythm returned to its former pace. With the critical shipment safely delivered and production resuming, the factory began to thrive once again. The German investors, impressed by Claire's resilience, pledged their continued support, and workers slowly began to trust her as their leader. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Claire had proven to herself, and to everyone else, that she could face even the darkest threats and emerge stronger. Kane's reign of terror was over, and though the battle had been fierce, Claire knew the hardest part of her journey was still ahead. But she was no longer just a cleaning lady. She was the leader of Sunrise Electronics, and nothing would stop her from rebuilding the factory and its future. Months passed, and Sunrise Electronics had undergone a transformation that no one, not even Claire, could have imagined. The once dying factory now hummed with life, its workers moving with purpose and pride. The walls, once stained with neglect and corruption, were now a symbol of renewal. Claire had earned the respect and trust of every worker on the floor. The factory operated transparently, its finances in order, and the workers, once wary of the new leadership, now saw Claire as more than just their boss. She had become their beacon of hope. The factory's revival wasn't just about production lines and profits. It was about rebuilding trust, restoring dignity, and proving that, even in the most dire situations, change was possible. Claire had learned that leadership wasn't about titles or authority. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity and doing what was right, even when it was the hardest thing to do. She had faced sabotage, betrayal, and constant challenges, yet she stood unshaken. In doing so, she had earned the respect, not just of the investors, but of the people who mattered most, the workers who had struggled alongside her. Claire had come full circle. She was no longer the quiet, invisible woman who scrubbed floors. She had become the leader who breathed new life into the factory and the community it supported. The factory floor was a place of hope now, not just for survival, but for growth. The workers, who had once been on edge, now moved with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that their future was secure. As Claire stood at the edge of the factory floor, watching the bustling activity of her workers, she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The transformation of the factory mirrored her own journey, once broken and uncertain, now strong and resolute. She had fought for every inch of progress, and now the future was bright. "This is only the beginning," Claire whispered to herself, her voice full of determination. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was ready to lead them into a new future. The journey had just begun, and with the lessons she had learned and the strength she had discovered within herself, Claire knew that nothing could stop her now. The factory was reborn, and so was she.